Of all the products at a farmer's market, I think most of us will agree that fresh produce is uniquely important. This is the reason a farmer's market is thusly named in the first place. It's therefore important that we do what we can to ensure the presence of these products at our market and the success of those producing them. Unfortunately, the Washington State Farmers Market Association has guidelines which create an unnecessary burden, not only for our farmers but for Washington markets as a whole. In order to remain in good standing with WSFMA, a market's farmers must have gross sales that exceed those of processors and resellers combined. In addition, total sales of farmers, processors, and resellers must surpass those of artisans, crafters, and prepared food vendors. To monitor compliance, member markets are obligated to collect and report total gross sales for each vendor category annually. If these guidelines are not met, or are not adopted within the approved timeframe, WSFMA can revoke the market's membership. Markets facing challenges in meeting these requirements can request a temporary exemption, which must include an adoption plan and an extension deadline of no longer than 2 years. And if a market's WSFMA membership gets revoked, the market loses its insurance policy, which has group discounted rates. There is something very counterintuitive and disconcerting about this arrangement, where an entity that is presumably there to help farmers also wields the power to revoke market memberships, resulting in the loss of an entire market's group insurance policies. Markets in the more urban settings are clearly adversely affected by this one-size-fits-all policy, as these communities simply do not have as many farmers as the more rural areas. This puts unnecessary pressure on these markets to bring in farmers from other areas, which flies in the face of the local food movement. It also makes it difficult for these markets to encourage non-farmer vendors to join them, helping to grow and create the symbiotic diversity that make farmers markets so appealing and so effective. What would really help farmers and farmers markets as a whole would be to allow the diverse communities across the state of Washington to operate as the unique groups that they naturally are, without any impact on WSFMA membership status and discounted group insurance policies. As it stands, the farmers market movement is being checked in precisely the areas where the big agribusiness corporations sell most of their products, and where a farmers market movement could potentially have the greatest positive impact. WSFMA did not impose these standards at their inception in 1979. Early guidelines focused on market organization, vendor participation, and fair selling practices. A majority of vendors needed to be farmers selling what they grew, but there were no sales ratios demanding the 51% farmer sales. This was part of the Roots guidelines, which were gradually adopted and didn't become official WSFMA policy until 2014. Incidentally, just a few years prior to the official establishment of WSFMA Roots guidelines in 2014, Washington farmers markets had taken another blow from the regulatory apparatus. In 2012, the Cottage Food Bill went into effect and was presumably going to benefit small-scale food producers by allowing them to legally produce low-risk foods in their home kitchens and sell them at places like farmers markets. What they forgot to mention was that farmers markets were already doing this long before that bill was passed, and with no ill effects or coherent rationale for reform. The bill did bring something that was new, however, which was a lot of red tape and additional fees. Everyone who had already been selling low-risk foods like cakes, cookies, jams, jellies, drinks that they made in their own kitchens could no longer do that before doing the following: submitting an application to the Washington State Department of Agriculture, getting their kitchen inspected by the County Public Health Department, upgrading their kitchens to meet the health department's standards, being subjected to periodic checks, and of course, paying all the requisite fees to pay for all this surveillance. This bill also set a cap of $15,000 on sales, which of course had not been the case before the bill was passed. This obscenely low cap was raised to $25,000 in 2015 and to $35,000 in 2020. In 2024, Senate Bill 5107 was introduced, proposing to further increase the annual gross sales cap to $50,000. This bill is still under consideration as of March 2025. It boggles the mind that anyone could believe there ought to be any cap at all. This would be a better idea if we were talking about a cap on similar products produced by large corporations. Unfortunately, we're talking about homemade foods being sold at farmers markets. We see this often in many bureaucracies which so often lack the resources, time, energy, budget to give the many nuanced issues they attend to sufficient attention. If they are any good at helping small business of any sort, they are eventually co-opted by larger players who do have the resources and who benefit the most from influencing standards, certifications, and regulations. Even if the bureaucracy had good intentions initially, they slowly become more in the service of the few rather than the many. We saw this with the organic food certification, which was once intended to empower small farmers, until corporate agribusiness infiltrated organic industry boards and reshaped standards to accommodate industrial-scale organic farming. We saw a very similar thing with the fair trade movement, where well-intended standards and regulatory agencies were eventually co-opted by larger producers through corporate lobbying and regulatory capture. Other bureaucratic hurdles increasingly being placed before the farmers' market movement in Washington have included zoning restrictions and special or temporary use permits. If we're going to advance the farmers' market movement in Washington any further, or any grassroots movement for that matter, then we're going to have to call out the examples of institutional capture, which have practically become axiomatic in today's economic landscape. This includes not only the government regulatory apparatus, but also non-governmental entities in the orbit of consumer advocacy groups, labor unions, and human rights organizations, all of which have been targets for co-optation by big business interests in the past. The results of these efforts have varied from channeling reformist energy into safe, non-threatening directions that would not challenge the core structures of power, to outright enhancing these core structures, and have been extensively documented by many noted historians and prominent scholars, including Gabriel Kolko, James Peck, George Stigler, Julie Guthman, and many others. Regardless of what prompted the establishment of their current roots guidelines, I hope the good people at WSFMA will recognize the unnecessary strain these one-size-fits-all standards are putting on a very diverse array of farmers markets in Washington, so that this wonderful movement can continue to flourish going forward.